too often do we find ourselves slogging through the endless abyss of Netflix, Crunchyroll, or Hulu, trying to find something that will satiate our hunger for entertainment, or perhaps to find something more. That diamond in the rough, that it show, the one show that will stick with us forever, a show that holds more meaning for some people than the endless amounts of episodes that they will continue to consume in their lifetime. A couple of those series for me would be either Slayers or Code Geass, Lelouch of the Rebellion, but for other people it's Gainax's critically acclaimed series from 2000, simply called Fooly Cooly. At the time, it was one of anime's most creative endeavors, bringing together different art styles and different techniques, as well as making most of their music revolving around a single band's catalog, rather than composing their own. However, the years have continued, and Fooly Cooly has had multiple sequels, or spin-offs depending on your point of view. Do they hold up as well? Have they entered the cultural zeitgeist as a worthy successor to this 2000s classic? Well, you've read the title. So, spoiler alert, I guess. Hi, I'm Greenline, and this is Fooly Cooly, a descent into mediocrity. The 90s was an amazing decade for Studio Gainax, although the 90s was also a terrible decade for Studio Gainax. So what happened in the 90s exactly? Well, Neon Genesis Evangelion happened. If you're any kind of familiar with anime, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Evangelion was a cultural touchstone in Japan, and it made Studio Gainax a whole lot of money. Prior to Evangelion, the studio had a handful of decent projects, such as Royal Space Force, Naota, and Gunbuster. But none of these had really put them on the map. Not until Neon Genesis Evangelion. So what's the problem, Greenline? They were clearly successful. Yes, but then they committed tax evasion. In 1999, the Tokyo Regional Taxation Bureau accused Studio Gainax for evading taxes. The math just wasn't adding up. Okay, how much money were they missing? Oh, you know, 1.56 billion yen, or 13 million in USD. Oops. Now, to be clear, I kinda don't blame them. Gainax up to this point had been coasting off of various projects with little success. As far as I'm aware, they weren't broke, but they were far from profitable, like living paycheck to paycheck. Evangelion was a success. Matter of fact, it wasn't a success, it was the success. With as much money that came from that success, I don't blame them for losing track of some of it, for being a little over their heads when it came to the sheer amount that they were earning from just one project. And when I say, specifically losing track, I don't mean they simply lost some of the money. It's reasonable to assume that they knew how to pay their taxes. However, when you're a studio just made of friends and buddies, how many of them do you think knew how to handle that much money? I know I wouldn't, so they pawned it off on somebody else. The accountant was arrested. Why am I saying all this? Despite all this, though, a year later, Gainax would be able to create what is considered by most, anyways, a phenomenal anime. Our story begins in a small town where supposedly nothing ever happened. It's apparently so engraved in the lives of the townsfolk that the most out-of-pocket stuff can happen, and they won't even barely take notice. Or at least it won't leave this lasting impact. Hey guys, do you remember that time where the class president produced a robot from her head? Yeah, that was pretty weird. Anyways, do you think Miyajin will be able to fix her car? Lol, no. And in this small town, we open up on the character of Naota hanging out with his brother's ex-girlfriend. This is Mamimi, and she awkwardly embraces him, and Naota narrates the new medical mechanica factory. The way he describes it, though, it's almost as if it's a new fast food joint in a small town rather than this massive factory, giving a new wave of jobs around town. As the two are about to part ways, the infamous Haruko makes her appearance, as she smashes into Naota with her bright yellow Vespa, and Fooly Cooly as you know it kicks off. This will prove as a good segue into the main topic for the moment. If I could describe the animation into one phrase, it would be all over the place. And in some cases, that turns out to be great. Like in this scene I was just talking about, as Haruko slams into Naota with the energy of a Saturday morning Looney Tunes cartoon. And then she tries to bring him back with a kiss, and the camera does this 360 no-scope view of the whole situation using CGI in the background. They then take a page from Deadpool and even comment on the situation. Later in that same episode, when Naota returns home to find Haruko eating dinner at his table, the entire thing is drawn like it's from a manga. And a few episodes later, one scene completely turns into an episode of South Park. The animation in the show is completely bonkers and off the wall at times. For that reason, I do like FLCL, but a series cannot simply be judged by its animation alone. I find myself in an awkward position when describing the story of FLCL, because when I first initially watched the show, I was a bit taken aback by how everything seemed to be slow going for the narrative. But alas, this is my own fault because I didn't realize that FLCL isn't your standard 12-episode or seasonal anime. It's an OVA series. As such, when it came to rewatching it for this video, I had a newfound respect for FLCL, because it was less about its overarching narrative and more about its characters. Naota, as previously discussed, finds himself at the end of Haruko's guitar when she first introduces herself after she gives him the kiss of life. As the story continues, Naoto finds himself growing a robot out of his head that ends up fighting other sentient robots. This is all in an effort to get Naoto to create NO energy to unleash Adamisk, a mysterious being dubbed the Pirate King, and one so powerful he could even destroy entire star systems. When watching this for the first time, I thought Haruko was deeply in love with him. However, upon subsequent rewatches, I've come to discover that it's more, in fact, an infatuation with the intent to steal his power for herself. At the end of it all, Adamisk escapes, and Haruko is left to chase after him. And that's pretty much the overarching narrative of FLCL. Although, if you ask most people, the narrative is probably the last thing on viewers' minds. Because more often than not, it's more about the characters and their personal journeys throughout the series that draws you in. Naota, for example, narrates the opening line about the town where nothing ever happens. Despite this, though, Naota never seems to want to leave. It always seems that he's mostly content with his life here in this small town. He does miss his brother, who has moved away to play baseball, and ultimately does change, mostly due to his interactions with Haruko. If I'm being honest with myself though, I would really like to know what kind of relationship he had with his father before his mother's death, and most importantly his brother, who is brought up throughout the series. Outside of the obvious things you've heard about this show, with his coming of age and discovering his adulthood, let's just say I still think that the overall change with the character is somewhat minimal. When the story ends, he is somewhat more content with his small town, at least compared to the sad little boy that we saw at the beginning of the series. He is enjoying company with his friends, so I suppose he has changed for the better. Okay, Mamimi. Do I really have to talk about Mamimi? Okay, I'll do it. Mamimi is rather bizarre in my opinion. When we first start the series, she is hanging out with Naoto and hanging on to him like a fucking leech. She's his brother's ex-girlfriend and making this scene of biting his earlobe rather weird. But then again, that's kind of the point. In episode 2, it's revealed that Naoto's brother, Tatsuku, saved her from the school fire and she's been attached to him ever since. After which, at some point, they started dating. But once he left, Mamimi had nothing to do and no one to go to. Because it's quite possible that her parents are separated, or worse, dead. And without her boyfriend, it seems that she's being bullied at school. Although that could have happened when Tatsuku was around. It's only after everything quiets down and the dust settles where she finally decides to leave town for good and become a photographer. Realizing that her ex-boyfriend will not come back for her and his little brother can't keep entertaining her. It's actually nice to hear that she's become a photographer, or at least trying to be one, as we see her taking photos regularly throughout the series. Alright, so I've covered most of the important people of FLCL. However, I think there's one more character that can be added to the principal cast. Eri is one of Naoto's classmates that has a strong presence in the 3rd episode. It opens up with her being driven to school by her father's secretary, who was fucking her father the previous night. Well, alright then. Eri doesn't seem to care too much about the situation, having a nonchalant attitude about her father's affair. For the remainder of the episode, she gets caught up in Haruko and Naoto's problems, and ends up producing a robot herself. I just thought I'd bring her up because she and Naoto seem to be cut from the same cloth, both being fed up with their parents and having a hard time growing up. They also seem relatively close by the end of the series. And what I find interesting, at least to me, is the fact when I first watched this, I thought Naoto would end up kissing Mamimi and get into some sort of relationship down the road. But now that I've watched it for a 3rd time, almost 8 years later, I think Naoto and Eri would make a cuter couple. Now, is that everyone? Oh, wait! I forgot about the single most important character of the series. Or at least the one who carries it the most. Haruko Haruhara is arguably one of the most important, if not the most important character in FLCL. At the very least, she's what I would call the poster child for this series. With her first introduction, she literally comes out swinging, capturing the hearts and minds of young boys and girls alike. and any man she seems to come across ends up getting ensnared in her schemes in one way or the other. While she seems nice at first, there's always seemed to be an alternative agenda behind everything she says. It's not until we come across Commander Amuro that we finally learn the truth behind Haruko's actions. She's just using Naota and trying to get him to unleash Animus so she can steal his NO. And once the so-called Pirate King makes his escape, she follows him and leaves Naoto and the others behind. For what it's worth, she does ask him if he wants to come along, but ultimately decides he probably shouldn't. And this is where the OVA series comes to a close. Haruko takes off and is never to be seen again. Naoto returns to school with his friends, and I think he ultimately finds himself in a better place mentally. Overall, I'd say my opinions of this series are thus. While I understand other people's opinions of the series as a whole, for me it didn't hit the same. For many people, you saw it at the right place at the right time in your life. In my personal situation, I found Fooly Cooly after having watched several other anime. While I found the visuals interesting, nothing really grabbed me about its story or its characters. That being said, watching it this last time around, I finally understand why people like it so much. There is a certain charm to these cast of characters and the struggles that they go through. The story of Fooly Cooly is something that could only have been done by this team, being free to experiment with these animation styles with the help of Production IG, and telling such an out there story that you can only find in anime. Fooly Cooly is like lightning in a bottle, and quite frankly, I don't think you could capture it twice. Its story is one that you should only tell once and leave it at that, because quite frankly, I'm not sure what you could do when producing a sequel to this wild story. Yeah, I know. Hey you, are you a subscriber? You're not? Well, I'm looking to get 10k subscribers by next summer. So if you wouldn't mind hitting that subscribe button, that would be super freaking cool, man. In 1752, Benjamin Franklin proposed an experiment to capture lightning in a bottle. The idea to do something that is so rare and extraordinary that it possibly can't be replicated all that often. To me, that's what this series Fooly Cooly feels like. Gainax and Production IG coming together and experimenting with animation to create Fooly Cooly. With all that creativity came a modicum of success. And with the success usually comes money. Well, further down the road, there came money. Like, let's just say 16 years later. Although, to be fair to the Fooly Cooly sequels, that isn't the full story. In an interview about the behind-the-scenes production of Fooly Cooly Seasons 2 and 3, the CEO of Production IG, Mitsuhisa Ishikawa, stated that he actually wanted to make more Fooly Cooly when it ended. However, Gainax, as well as creator Kazuya Tsurumaki, declined and said that it was over and that he had told the story that he wanted to tell. Still though, Production IG bided their time, and eventually the rights to Fooly Cooly went up for purchase. So, with the series now purchased, all that was left to do was secure the funding to make sequels. But that was easier said than done, because Fooly Cooly wasn't exactly the most profitable in Japan. It had some notoriety, sure, because Gainax had worked on it, but it wasn't a household name. However, it did get critical acclaim in America, and so Production IG turned to the group that could help them secure a sequel. As mentioned before, the previous Fooly Cooly series had animation that was pretty all over the place, but in a good way. You know, the manga panels and their 3D backgrounds. So how does the second season compare? Well, it's interesting with its first dystopian opening, alongside some interesting scenes in episode 5. This one scene that seemed to use watercolor painting style of animation, and another scene that harkened back to the one manga scene in the original series. But despite this, it still feels bland overall. Most episodes have this generic style of animation, and don't feel like anything like the original OVAs. And even in that one scene that I mentioned that had the manga art, it just seems kind of bland and boring. I do understand that it was trying to create more of a shoujo vibe, but even in that regard, it was rather lackluster. I get that Hidomi is depressed, but I don't understand why these pages seem muted. It's like it's the first draft. In an earlier scene of Fooly Cooly Original that's animated by Shinya Ohara, looks like this. It looks disgusting. Possibly the grossest thing I've seen out of anime next to Ping Pong the animation. That being said, it's still interesting. Nothing outside of episode 5 comes close to anything in the original. So I guess that just leaves us to talk about the story and the characters. Let me knock out the characters first and then I'll finish with the story. Hidomi Hibajuti is the lead this time around. When I watched the premiere all those years ago, I found myself not liking Hidomi all that much. I thought she was too quiet and too boring. While it's true that Naota was somewhat quiet and reserved, I felt that he was more talkative and expressed his overall emotions better. Hidomi isn't nearly as straightforward as her predecessor. At the start of the series, we find her dreaming about a dystopian world with her being the sole survivor, but even she seems to be falling apart. Or maybe it's that everything else is fine and she's the only one crumbling to dust. In any case, I find it hard to specifically say what it is. My own personal hypothesis is that Hidomi suffers from either bipolar depression or social anxiety. When we see her, she is often using her headphones and shielding her ears. Perhaps this was a sign she was shielding herself from outside stimuli. Hidomi often talks about overflowing, and yes, I know this was something often said by Mamimi, but I also feel that it could be applied to Hidomi as well. If what we believe what I've said about her is true, then it could be possible her overflowing could have been her emotions. Maybe earlier on in her life, she was happier until her father left. And then, when her father left to pursue his new job, maybe that's what triggered her to shut herself off from her emotions and communication. However, at the end of it all, she is able to gather the strength and save Ide. She is even able to criticize Haruko about her relationship with Animusk. In the end, though, I do believe she changes for the better. Ide is the next character, and he's our secondary main character? No, that's not entirely accurate, but he is a key figure in Fully Progressive, so I'll opt to include him here. We are first introduced to him when Hidomi entered her classroom for the first time. Upon meeting Ide, we are being reintroduced to Haruko later on in the episode, and it is inferred that she had interacted with Ide, and towards the end of the second episode, when Ide is producing monsters from his head, that theory is all but confirmed. Despite all this, though, it seems that Ide has a crush on Hidomi. He even ends up resisting Haruko's advances because of his love for her. We also come to find out that he's a hard worker and tries to support his family. Ultimately, everything works out for him because in the end, he gets the girl, and I suppose that counts for something. Julia Jinyu, or simply Jinyu, because quite frankly, nobody calls her by her first name, so much that I barely remember that it exists. Anyways, Jinyu is Haruko's other half. No, she's not Haruko's sexual partner. She's actually her other half. When Haruko took Animusk's power for herself, it couldn't be contained. So, as a result, Jinyu was formed from Haruko. A scene so important that it was put at the end credits. Yeah, let's put it during the end credits where, everybody turns off the episode. Whose brilliant idea was to put this groundbreaking plot point at the end credits? I digress. Jinyu acts as a foil to Haruko. As the series progresses, I didn't do that on purpose actually. Jinyu tries to get both Hidomi and Ide away from Haruko on multiple occasions until eventually, midway through the series, Haruko devours her, although Jinyu is brought back a few episodes later. She does serve an important role in Haruko's development towards the end. When Animusk leaves again, Jinyu comforts Haruko as they both sulk over their boyfriend? I am not quite sure. Despite playing an important role in this particular series, however, Jinyu never appears again, which is bizarre, but I suppose that's par for the course for Fully Cooley. Oh, she also drives a Chevrolet Bel Air, because Haruko rides a Vespa. Get it? This thing is like the other thing. I wish we could have seen her one more time, but you know how it goes. Alright, let's move on to the story. While it's true that the original Fully Cooley didn't really have a story, as a part of its 6-episode run, it was more about its characters than anything else. The main cast of characters are what drives the plot of Fully Cooley. Here, though, in Progressive, I think it's a little of both. While the characters of Progressive drive its plot for the most part, it does have an overarching story. Well, that's the tricky part. You see, Progressive does kind of have a plot, although it's hard to make sense of it at times. It's not as if I don't know the events that unfold, because I do, it's just that I have a hard time making sense as to how these plot points fit together cohesively. To get straight to the point, I think too much is going on, especially towards the end. While it's not my favorite, I can follow the events that unfold between Hidomi, Haruko, and Ide. I cannot say the same thing for the supporting cast. First, there's Hidomi's mom, which is fine if you want to include her. We have Ide's random-ass friend and his rent-a-girlfriend who ends up turning into a plant? Not to mention this plant girlfriend's supposed dad. At least according to the wiki, he's also Commander Amuro's son, too? Fun fact, at some point he played Sonic and Shadow the Hedgehog. Wait, if this guy is Commander Amuro's son, how many years have gone by since the first iteration of Fooly Cooly? Oh well, and then there's this old lady who ends up showing up towards the end. I have no idea who she is or how she falls into the story proper. This climax feels like there's way too much going on with the fight with Medical Mechanica and the plant, or Iron depending on your definition. I feel like the series would have done a lot better if it had been somewhat shorter. If the series had only been, let's say, 3 episodes. I think there could have been something here. As it is, it feels a bit stretched out and too long. And then it ends with a really bizarre message.
There's nothing I want to be. There's nothing I want to do. And that's probably not the best way to be. But you know what? It probably doesn't matter.
Please tell me that's not the actual message. That makes almost little to no sense. Is that the secret message left behind by the creators? Based on the behind the scenes information that we have, they seemed really excited to work on the sequel. But if what they're saying here at the end is true, then why did they work on it to begin with? Maybe it's trying to say that it's okay being content with who you are. But I find that's a stretch. And to be honest with you, that statement from Hidomi feels somewhat insulting after watching her go through what she did. Hidomi herself clearly wants to date Ide and has desires of continuing to run her cafe with her mom. So I feel like it doesn't apply to the character itself. So I'm not sure what to make of this finale. When I first started this rewatch, I had pretty low expectations going in, as this was one of the worst ones of the bunch in my opinion. The Fooly Cooly sequels, I mean. It was probably my least favorite, even if you include that monstrosity. But coming out of it, I found way more value than I expected to. However, I still feel that it's far less than the original. The story is a mess, yes, even compared to the original, and I really wished it had maintained focus on its main quartet of characters. When it ended for the first time, I thought nothing of it and was really hoping for the next season to be better. So, was it? When I experienced the original Fooly Cooly for the first time, my opinions of it were somewhat average. So, this may come as no surprise, I wasn't looking forward to the sequel. And then, once it came out and the sequel was far worse than I'd even imagined, I didn't have high hopes for the third installment. But maybe my expectations were so low that any conceivable positive thoughts in regards to this show would have been a guiding light in a sea of, well, mediocrity. Because on my first initial viewing of this series, I actually really enjoyed it. But after all these years, does it hold up under the microscope? Or was it that my expectations were in fact so low that I thought an average series was far superior? Surprisingly, I found Alternative quite enjoyable. Although, to be fair, there are a few hiccups along the way. Alright, let's discuss the story and characters. Matter of fact, does Alternative even have a story? I mean, kind of? Alternative, despite how loose it might be, does have a plot. It's not worth going over though, I think. All you need to know is that irons are coming to flatten the Earth. Again. And that 1% of the human race is leaving Earth in space shuttles. But personally, I'm fine with that. The reason being is that I've truly never cared about the plot of Fooly Cooly. In the original series, the irons were just a means of explaining different forces in life coming to destroy your creativity and flatten your brain. The idea of you charging along in your monotonous life, doing the same thing over and over, ultimately leaving your growth stunted along with your creativity. No, Fooly Cooly is truly at its best when it's about its characters and less about its plot. So let's talk about Alternative's leading lady, Kana. Kana is a high school student who likes spending time with her friends. That sounds like every girl you've ever known, and I suppose to an extent you'd be right. But I find her far more entertaining than her progressive counterpart. I found Hitomi incredibly boring to watch, even at the end. But by contrast, Kana has high energy levels in quite a few episodes, and the way she bounces off her friends in some of these scenes is actually quite funny to watch. She's also seemingly quite poor. Her shoes are worn down and her phone is broken. By contrast, her oldest friend, named Pets, is filthy stinking rich. Although we don't find this out until the second to last episode. One more important thing that I'll add before I move on is that Kana is very protective and loving of her friends. She will go out of her way even when they don't want her to and help them out. This is ultimately her core character trait that is consistent throughout the entire series. On 3 separate occasions, she butts in on her friends' business without them asking her to. And in a lot of ways, this really is considered a character flaw. Someone who doesn't know when to leave something alone and let somebody else handle this on their own. Sometimes we don't ask for help and we don't need it. However, I also see the other side of the coin. The idea that you cherish and love somebody so much that you would go out of your way, even when they don't want you to, and help them succeed. So, I guess it's 50-50. Hijiri is the popular one, and arguably the most pretty out of the bunch. She is seen modeling in magazines and is presented as the school's top girl. When I watched Alternative for the first time, I had thought she had no interest in Kana and her friends, and I would actually find out that she's actually in the friend group. In the second episode, we focus more on her character. Her friends find out she's dating this older guy who's a photographer. Later, we see him cheating on her with Haruko, and Kana drags her other friends along to help Hijiri break up with him. But in the end, Hijiri doesn't care because she views herself the same way as her ex. But then his camera breaks and he's revealed to be an absolute baby, and I think it's here we learn an interesting lesson. That sometimes being mature and acting grown up is overrated, especially when you still have some of your youth left. Alright, I think we can move on to the fat one. Boo! What? You were all thinking it. I just said it. Anyways, Mozan is the big one of the group, okay? She can often be seen eating a lot of snacks and stuffing her face. Although, I don't need to give her grief because her friends give her plenty of shit. And really, those are the best kinds of friends. And none of this stops her from following her dreams of being a fashion designer. Mozan spends most of her time in episode 3 working herself to the point of exhaustion. It's here that we see Kana again insert herself, like she always does, and help out her friend. This gets her in trouble with Mozan, but ultimately they smooth things over in the end. I unfortunately cannot say the same thing for the last friend I'm going to talk about. And now we get to my favorite member of the friend group, Tomomi, or as she's better known by her friends, Pets. In the beginning of the series, she's often seen making fun of Mozan, and even later taking photos of Hijiri's butt. She comes across as a really fun character in the beginning, although in the middle, not too much happens, and then towards the end, she turns out to be a total bitch. She goes from being one of my favorite characters to being my least favorite in a matter of minutes. She whines and complains that Kana involves herself in her problems, which, if you just up and leave, I would expect my best friends to come after me and find out what the hell happened. But then she whines and complains about the boy they both had a crush on, and Kana turned him down. But Pets liked him too! Okay, then say something about it. To, I don't know, your best friend. I thought the point of a girl's BFF is to tell them everything.
The day that we sign up and say that we best friends, that means that my bullshit is your bullshit. And your bullshit is my bullshit.
Kana didn't even know about Pets being rich. And while the show claims that the other two friends knew, it's not like Mozan and Hijiri were told by Pets herself. They found out through other means. So Pets is just keeping all of this BS to herself, all of the time. That's fine. That's her prerogative. However, don't complain about your friend not knowing anything about you when you don't tell her anything about yourself. It's sad because it leaves a very sour taste in my mouth because of how everything just leaves off. Pets does swap hairpins for symbolism, I guess, but then just leaves and is never to be seen again until the final series. So overall, I think it's decent. Is there a lot going on plot-wise? No, sadly, I'm afraid not. But again, I think that's okay. Or at least for me. Well, these characters aren't groundbreaking. My editor found them extremely boring, but I found them endearing at times. And that comes from the perspective of someone who sat down to analyze alternative. I think I appreciated it more because I was so engrossed in the characters' motivations, so I could try to understand why I enjoyed the series for the first time. And I think the overall message somehow resonated with me. The idea of not necessarily wanting to grow up, and wanting things to stay the same, to capture one moment and hold on to it forever. But unfortunately, things move forward and things change, for better and for the worst. That being said, though, I don't think it holds up to the original. The animation, well, again, not bad, it just doesn't stand out that much. And the story is almost non-existent. If you were expecting more adventures with Haruko, you will be sorely disappointed. Oh yeah, speaking of which, I haven't talked about her in a while, have I? There's a reason for that. Have any of you guys sat down and watched something like Harry Potter and remember partway through that they changed the actor for Professor Dumbledore? Yes, the previous actor had passed away, so they needed to replace him, but I'm specifically talking about the situation where us, the viewer, we're watching the film, right? And we're thinking to ourselves, well, clearly this is the same character, and he's dressed the same and has the same mannerisms, but everything feels slightly off. Now, we eventually warm up to the new replacement and everything turns out fine, but I have this problem with Haruko. And this time, Haruko looks exactly the same, sounds the same, and I think acts like she normally would, for the most part. We'll get to it. Because upon my rewatch, I felt that she was an entirely different person. Or at the very least, she gave me the feelings that I had when Dumbledore got replaced. But Haruko's design didn't change all that much, and her voice, at least in English, is the same. So what gives? Why does she feel so different? In Progressive, everything seems to be fine at first. However, within a few episodes, our loud and obnoxious Haruko turns into what feels like a villain. To be clear, Haruko did have sinister intentions in the original, but for the most part she came off playful and non-malicious. In Progressive, it doesn't feel that way. Especially towards the last few episodes, Haruko will say and do things that come across as threatening. As a result, it feels almost out of character. Or rather, in this case, it doesn't feel like the same character. And in Alternative, it's another subject entirely. Haruko has gone in the complete opposite direction. She's now an officer for the Intergalactic Police? Excuse me? Okay, she mentioned this in the original series, but I thought it was a joke or some stupid kind of ruse. You know, like how in The Dark Knight, the Joker has multiple backstories. I thought it was that kind of thing, you know? But now she actually works for this organization and behaves for the most part. She has a handler named Conda, and she seems to listen to him most of the time, and he in turn gives her a decent amount of leeway. Although, there is something interesting that he calls her. Raharu. This same name was brought up in the original series by Commander Amuro. He states that this is her actual name, and Haruko is just an alias. Honestly, it could be a myriad of different things. It could be an alias, it could be a sibling, it could be a clone, or it could be an alternate version from a different universe. To be honest, I don't know. Honestly, that very first scene could have just been put there to get the viewer thinking about it, to add one layer of mystery to a complex character. In theory, it could explain why she's different because there are all these different versions of her. But I don't know that for sure, because it could also be that there were different directors and writers putting their own spin on the same character. But all this comes across as a little jarring. Anyways, let's move on. Up next is... oh no... Grunge. A lot of things could be said about this installment. Though, there are a few things that I rarely see mentioned when the fourth season of Fooly Cooly comes up. One of these things is that it was hardly ever marketed. Fooly Cooly Grunge was initially announced on March 17th, 2022, roughly 3.5 years after the initial airing of both Progressive and Alternative. And that's kind of bizarre, that we hadn't heard a peep after seasons 2 and 3. At the very least, Progressive and Alternative were hyped up by Adult Swim as well as Production IG. They were excited for the sequel seasons. However, when it comes to Grunge, it came out of left field. And when the initial news did come out, there was a full-blown trailer for it. How many times have you heard about that? Not a peep from a production, but then you do hear some news and there's a full-blown trailer. And the fact that both seasons 2 and 3 have physical releases, but Grunge as well as Shoegaze does not. At the time of this recording, it's been a little over a year, and we haven't heard anything about a DVD or Blu-ray release for seasons 4 and 5. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it was a bad show or that it had received bad publicity, but what did the fans think? They were tired. Yes, you do have the glass half full people in the comments of these articles talking about the release, but the majority was just fed up with these sequels. Most people's perceptions of seasons 2 and 3 is pretty much the same as mine. Progressive was not that great and Alternative was somewhat better, but for a lot of people, nothing can be better than the original. So, when you have fourth installment that not only has to contend with the fact that nobody is watching at this point, but also the fact that it's CGI, yeah, let's discuss that elephant in the room. Fooly Cooly Grunge is mostly CGI. It's not just the robots and a couple action scenes, it's everything including the characters, barring a few scenes. I'd really prefer it if my anime wasn't in this form. I know you've heard all this before, because this is the internet after all, but CGI and anime aren't really that good of a match. Oftentimes it comes across as clunky and not nearly as fluid as 2D animation. Just look at how they massacred Berserk in 2016. So when people like me come across something like Fooly Cooly Grunge for the first time, their first impressions are, well, not that great. But first impressions aren't everything, right? Surely we can have faith in Production IG will deliver a good product, right? After all, they animated CG backgrounds before, right? So maybe this time around they'll do something that really stands out. What's that? They're not animating it at all? Oh, Mont Blanc Pictures? That's who's responsible for the animation. Well, I've got good news and bad news. The good news is most of their work centers around CGI. The bad news is they've only done 4 productions. Oh boy. I've heard a few ramblings on the internet that this show doesn't actually look all that bad. Yeah, it doesn't look nearly as bad as Berserk 2016, but it's still terrible. I know I just outed myself as someone who doesn't like CGI in anime, but I really can't stand this season. Look at all the background characters. They've all got the same face. They tried to write this off in the show as just being a grown-up thing, but you and I both know the real reason why this exists. It would have taken too much time for them to draw all these faces on these characters. Or how about when Haruko first introduces herself to Shin, and the show tries to show off her ass? Both the animation and camera work can't make her butt look good, so it comes off looking terrible and unappealing. And then, a couple scenes later, Haruko kisses Shin, and they have a heart around their lips because the models can't kiss without it looking broken. But that's okay. So long as the story and characters are good, it should make the series much more watchable. I remember the characters being at least pretty good, right? Spoiler alert. I misremembered. The story. There is no story. Yeah, I hear that one guy in the back. Yes, there is. Fine, have it your way. Haruko creates chaos, and while said chaos is going about, 3 friends try to make it out alive. Kind of. Look, there's only 3 OVAs to Grunge. That's not much of a story because it's mostly about the characters. If I tried to explain this story in detail, I would have an aneurysm.
Here.
I love it.
What's wrong?
Take it.
See you later, old man. The last shuttle is leaving tonight.
Here we go, boys.
Criminals coming together.
Auto-John Killer!
No.
Orinoco.
Your dad made this?
But she's the mayor's woman. I hate these flies. Ta-da! Oh, crap!
What you just saw happens all in one night. Look, I'm just going to continue what I've been doing. It's best if I explain the story through its characters, so let's get started. We are first introduced to Naota, Shin. His name is Shin. But it also feels like they copied too much from Naota. You know that famous meme, right? You can copy my homework, but don't make it look too obvious? Well, the writers of Grunge made it look too obvious. For all intents and purposes, this might as well be Naota, with slight differences. Instead of going to school for the most part, Shin just works at his father's sushi shop. But everything else almost feels the exact same. Shin encounters Haruko, who teases him and eventually kisses him so that he can produce NO from his forehead and hijinks ensue. Didn't you just skip a few details, Green Line? No, I didn't. The only thing I might have skipped was the mayor's call for martial law. But that's it. Everything happens so fast, but I'm going to elaborate more as we continue. Let's move on to Shin's friends. Shunari is one of Shin's friends who... I'm sorry, what am I looking at? Should we give Marvel a call? Because I feel like their intellectual property is being infringed. He's just the Thing from Fantastic Four. Okay, all that aside, what does Shunari bring to the table? Because quite frankly, his buddy Shin isn't all that well developed as a character. Thankfully, Shunari is slightly more developed, although it's only a little bit. Shunari has the benefit of having an older brother and having somewhat of a backstory. The second episode starts off with Shunari and his brother Denari throwing the remains of their parents into the sea. You probably thought I should have given that previous line just now a little bit more weight than I did, but I didn't want to give it any unnecessary attention, because the show sure didn't. I'd also like to point out that these two are built like houses, and yet their parents' body bags look more human-sized than anything. I know this because they ended up dumping humans into the sea later on. Shunari is teased as a child by his classmates and Shin stands up for him, and I suspect that's how they became friends. His elder brother Dainari ends up joining the Yakuza and is a heavy hitter for their gang, quite literally. It's revealed that he does all this in an effort to get his brother off the planet. Dainari ends up passing away, however, due to an encounter with another member of their species of sorts and dies in an explosion. I'm convinced this was partly due to Haruko injuring him early on. While Dainari is passed out, Haruko steals a piece of his body to give it to another one of Shunari and Shin's friends, Orinoko. During the climax, Shunari finds out that Haruko, while also being the mistress of the Yakuza boss, was also the mistress for the mayor. The same mayor who is responsible for his brother's death. I bring this up because I thought he was going to confront her about it, but he doesn't. It's just left there on the cutting room floor. And despite all this effort of the brother saving up his savings so his brother can get off the planet, instead he decides to stay. Cool. I'm glad your brother saved up all that money so you could just waste all of it and not buy a ticket. Oh, thank goodness we made it to the last one. Orinoko is the last episode, as well as the final friend of the trio. Her design reminds me of some kind of 2010s e-girl, but that's just me. Orinoko works as a blacksmith with her father and makes Shin a sushi knife, and then later on makes katana for Shinori. She spends most of her section of the story collecting or in the dump. Oh, yeah. This planet is basically a garbage heap. And because this planet is a garbage heap, it's hard to find decent metal ore. She eventually finds some with the help of her friends and Haruko and ends up making a katana. After the sword is finished, her father dies, finishing his masterpiece. The show makes this out to be a joke, by the way. It's fine as long as the father does a fake death, but he doesn't. He legit dies. But the show plays this off as if he's going to make it, but then he doesn't. It's a really stupid joke. Then, the final episode tries to tear out the heartstrings by having the robot that worked for them actually turn out to be Orinoko's mother. This in theory could have worked, but there's not nearly enough time to make this moment satisfactory. Orinoko is the only one out of her friends to make it off the planet and onto the final shuttle. Cool. Awesome, Orinoko. I'm glad you could make it off. And your friends can stay here in the garbage dump and rot away. What are you still doing here? Asked Ferris Bueller. The show's over. I'm not kidding. This series, or rather this season, only has 3 episodes as previously mentioned. And therein lies one of the main problems. It's too short. Or it is too many characters. Take your pick. And speaking of which, Commander Amuro is in this, although he has nothing to do. Which proves my point. This series is too bloated. There's too much going on for any of these concepts to be fully fleshed out. Who is Shin, and what are his motivations? He's just a carbon copy of Naota at this point. No, scratch that, he's even less. And what about Shunari? What's his species? Why are all they fated to drink themselves into a stupor? While it's true he was given significantly more than Shin, it's still not nearly enough to understand him as a character, really. The series itself doesn't have enough time to give answers to these questions. Like when Shonari wants to find out the connection between Haruko and the mayor, Orinoco is in the exact same boat. At the end of it all, we barely know nothing about her mother, being the robot, and by the time it's revealed, you couldn't be bothered to care about the plot twist because there was nothing built up to it. This series needed 2 or 3 more OVAs. It's basically chopped in half compared to its predecessors. Maybe if it had more time, some of these characters could be more fleshed out, and other characters could be more than just cameos. As it stands, this is nothing more than a husk of the previous 2 series, and that's saying a lot. So, no, it's not just the CGI, it's how the entire series is written. There's way too much going on to explain how anything works and how we're supposed to feel in regards to these characters. And then it ends in the most somber way possible, even though the show tries to play it off as uplifting somehow. Look, I know these aren't supposed to be happy endings necessarily, but in a lot of ways, this one scene is downright depressing. Orinoco leaves the planet to pursue better things, but she basically does it alone, and has no one. She's got her mom, but her mom's a fucking flash drive. And her 2 friends, who probably wanted to move on from this garbage planet, are still stuck here. So at the end of it all, what are you left with but a worse experience than progressive or alternative? So now what? What could you possibly do after this point? Most people would think that once you hit rock bottom, you can only go up, right? But there are times when you're simply too tired to care. You'd rather stay put than move forward. And I think that's what happened with a lot of people. Once they saw Grunge, Fooly Cooly was all but over for them. The ones who had initially given the series a chance had now fully decided to abandon it, leaving very few remaining for the final installment of Shoegaze. On the surface, it's not that bad, but it's not great either. As a matter of fact, it suffers from the same problems as Grunge. One of the main problems is that it's too short. It only has, again, 3 episodes. Let's make it clear that this is an OVA series, and so 3 episodes shouldn't really matter too much. This isn't your typical 1 or 2 core anime. However, 3 episodes isn't enough to cover all that's here. Let's get into it. Misaki is one of the 3-ish main characters of Shoegaze. Misaki recently transferred to a new high school and is incredibly introverted due to the fact that he can only see what I can describe as otherworldly beings. Everyone else around him is unable to see these ghost-like specters, causing him to keep to himself as he got older. But then, not long after he transfers, he meets a fellow classmate on the roof of the school named Harumi, and they decide to bomb a tower that happens to be a shopping center.
Boy, that escalated quickly.
I remember the first time watching this and thinking, that's rather strange, but they just must have made a small explosive. But no, when the bomb gets tossed out the window later in the episode, it damages a good part of the building. How did 2 teenagers get a hold of the materials to do this? I have no idea. Getting back to Misaki, I think he finds some level of comfort in Harumi. This is the first time in a while that he's had a decent friend. It also helps that he's driven by his, well, manhood. While this is a wild and crazy thing to do, give credit where credit is due. I feel like Misaki is disconnected from the world at this point, and any interaction, especially one that involves a sexual attraction, would have pushed him along regardless of who it was. And Misaki feels mostly original compared to Shin from Grunge. Misaki's partner in crime is Harumi, who...
Hey, wanna drink my pee?
What the fuck? I'm gonna need a minute. This has gotta be one of the most outlandish things I've heard in this series. And I've heard a lot of shit, seeing as though this is Fooly Cooly. And just so we're clear, it's not out of the ordinary of Fooly Cooly to do this, but for this to be one of the opening lines of the season is certainly something. Harumi is our secondary protagonist who encourages Misaki to go through the after-school program, let's just call it for YouTube's sake. She presents the call to action and drives forward the other 2 protagonists in the series. Harumi meets up with Misaki at the beginning and explains to him that she feels disconnected from the world. She tells him that she feels like she doesn't belong here. She feels out of place. So once we fully flesh her out, we're going to reveal it. Yeah, we're going to reveal that she's actually Haruko in disguise, right? No, this isn't Haruko at all. She's a completely separate character. I understand from a perspective that this isn't something terribly objectively speaking. However, subjectively, I don't know how I feel about this. Up until the reveal of Harumi and her identity, you could forgive anyone who thought this was Haruko, seeing as though she acted quite similar. She calls the male protagonist to action as well as using Misaki for her own purposes, or at least that's what it looked like from the outside. From the way she talks, her mannerisms, as well as the way she moves, it all feels similar to Haruko. Bear in mind that this is also the final installment in this series, at least at the time of recording this video. There isn't going to be a new Fooly for a while, and Haruko doesn't make an appearance. So this leaves her in this kind of random limbo of whatever the hell Grunge was. Not only that, it leaves Harumi feeling like a diet version of Haruko. So wait, if Harumi isn't Haruko, then who is she? The reason Harumi feels so disconnected from the world around her and feels like she doesn't belong is, well, because she technically doesn't. Harumi was actually a young boy from an alternate universe that was teleported or transplanted into another world when Medical Mechanica split the universes at the end of Alternative, leaving Harumi feeling displaced, because she was. Although I'm not too sure how this affects people in her universe. When female Harumi spawned into this world, how were the people she knew affected when she left? The show frames it as her very existence being erased, which makes sense to some extent, but when Harumi initially spawned into this world, she was given some sort of placement. Despite not belonging to this world, she had friends who knew her, and I assume a family that loved her. But now that's all been erased? Her very existence never really mattered, even though the universe seemed to have a Harumi of their own. Put simply, Harumi didn't just spawn out of nowhere to the surprise of many. It seemed she had a place there in this alternate universe. So where did that space go when she left? Was it filled by another person who had taken her place in the second universe? I don't know. I suppose it doesn't matter too much in the end. Let's move on to our final character, and a surprising return of one. Oh shit, Kana's back.
A surprise, to be sure, but a welcome one.
No, sorry, old man Palpatine, not this time. Kana's inclusion in this part in this story is just weird, which may come as a shock to my editor and the rest of you, seeing as though I really enjoyed Alternative, but her inclusion in this doesn't feel right. In fact, it feels like a slap in the face if you enjoyed Alternative in any shape or form, because Alternative's ending is at least semi-hopeful. Shoegaze takes whatever hope that ending had and throws it out the window. Kana does briefly talk to her friends in a single scene, but throughout most of the final season, she's pretty miserable. We spent most of our time with her in episode 2 while she's running errands for Harumi, who's just stalling for time. In this episode, we see Kana is tired, stressed, and annoyed. Any trace of that hopeful young girl from Alternative is long gone. There is nothing left but a husk of her former self. The sad part is I'd be fine with all of this if her backstory in Shoegaze wasn't this depressing slop. So after the end of Alternative, the agent Konda takes her under his wing and tries to activate her NO, but it fails. And so they try again, and again, and again. It doesn't end up working. It ends up being Misaki who is the trigger, and his NO that ends up being used to pull the universes back together. This leaves Kana as a character being utterly useless. I feel that this is a gap that Agent Konda could have easily fulfilled himself. There was no need to drag Kana into this, but I digress. But would you be surprised that that's not even the real slap in the face? No, the real insult is, for the most part anyways, all of this was pointless. After all this, even Misaki's NO does not work, because a giant worm-like creature appears at the end and causes the collisions of the two universes to stop. What was the point of all this? It all just ends up bitter, not bittersweet. Well, I suppose Harumi can get back to his original universe, and Kana briefly gets to see pets for all of 5 seconds. So I suppose that there's something to all of this. Hey, look at that. At the tail end of the series, we see Harumi once again. He's with his family, and he seems to be happy and runs into Misaki again. Wait, what? Why is Misaki here? Oh, he seems to have...
He calls himself Adamus.
What the fuck?
That had to have been my genuine reaction when I saw this for the first time. This is Adamusk? How? You know what? It doesn't matter. This is just how the series ends. It leaves just more questions than answers, and I don't know if it was for the best. I understand. Fooly Cooly has been kind of bizarre. Always has been, right? But if you were to ask any fan about a sequel, they would have laughed. It really didn't need any sequels. What could you possibly add to this series that was so random and quirky? And yet, a sequel was made. And we could point fingers all day, but it also doesn't matter. The sequels are here whether we like it or not. And not to sound like somebody coasting off the sequel hate, because there's some actual installments that I really do enjoy. As I mentioned before, I'm not the biggest fan of the first one, but it's still a decent watch. And yeah, I didn't like Progressive all that much, but at least it had some decent visuals that were somewhat similar to the original. And although my editor and others aren't really fans of Alternative, I liked its story and Kana as well as her friends. Everything else is just a bust for me. I don't think it hit the same way. And that's tough to tell creators. That a work they want to continue shouldn't be continued. Because Fooly Cooly really isn't the same as it once was. It's not the early 2000s anymore, where you can just experiment and have fun. This is now a property that has to make money. But not only that, have you ever stopped and thought to yourself, we are not the same anymore. We grew up, we got jobs, we have kids, we have different lives now. Trying to cater to fans of Fooly Cooly wasn't going to work with the same story and lesson about growing up. Do you remember the early 2000s when Disney tried to make direct-to-DVD sequels of their animated classics, and they posed the question, do you want to know what happens after Happily Ever After? And the answer at the end of the day is no, because nothing happens after that point. The story is done, and there's nothing left to be told. Sure, you can enjoy the characters, and maybe you want to see more of them, but what's the point? That's what these series of sequels feels like. An answer to a question no one asked. And until next time, guys.